continuing with chapter 4, the look here is going to be at section 2, which is about the Assyrian Empire. Now, when you think about Assyria, you got to think about military power and ruthless nature folks that they would attack, they would conquer, they would collect tribute. Oftentimes, they would intimidate many of their surrounding lands as well. Roman numeral 1 starts with the talk about Assyria as a military machine. It wasn't always that way. They kind of had to develop that mentality over time, similar to what the Spartans had to do in later Greece. But Assyria is an empire that originated in the northern part of Mesopotamia, and then around 850 BC, they began to acquire a large amount of land in southwest Asia. I will take a look at the quick map here on page 96 of the World History Patterns of Interaction book. Here we see all of this orangish yellow region here being controlled by the Assyrians roughly 650 BC. This is a pretty vast empire into Turkey, the modern day region of Iraq, part of Iran, and then into Egypt as well. Okay, Assyria accomplished this empire through the use of what most historians would say advanced military organization and also weaponry. We'll take a look at how that began. It really was because of playing defense to a lot of different attacks on them. The Assyrian homeland, which is in northern Mesopotamia, which is modern day Iraq, Syria, southern Turkey, is pretty flat, as we learned about with the Sumerians earlier on in the year. And it's unprotected by true natural barriers of defense, like mountain ranges, deserts, vast amounts of water, things of that nature. So therefore, invaders frequently swept down into Assyria from the nearby mountains, which are the Zagros Mountains, which are really, they're a passable mountain range, so they're not going to keep an army out. These invasions may have led to eventually the warlike behavior that the Assyrians developed. And why is this going to be? Well, the way that you have to defend yourself if you're constantly being attacked is through defensive mechanisms. And so you get really good at playing defense, but you also figure out what are the weaknesses of a certain defense. And so it's like coaching football. You start to look at, if you're a defensive guy, you start to be able to understand how offenses can attack. And so that's kind of how the Assyrians sort of looked at becoming a group that started to conquer others based on their experience in trying to be conquered. Now, they eventually gained their power through constant state of warfare. They built an empire that covered all of eastern Mesopotamia and all the way to the north, the Tigris River, and then all the way to the west to Egypt, as we saw on the map. The only way they could do that is through military strength. Here's an example. There was a king from Assyria named Sennacherib, and he bragged that during his lifetime he had destroyed 89 cities, 820 independent villages. He burned Babylon to the ground and then ordered all of its inhabitants to be killed. So this is just an example that the Assyrians were very ruthless, and they wanted to instill fear in their opponents. Capital C, let's talk about why they were successful. Well, they were actually very well equipped for battle because they had been battling for so long. They knew what you needed to have. They wore stiff leather and also some metal armor. They had copper and iron helmets. They had padded loin cloths and leather skirts, which were layered with metal scales. Their weapons consisted of iron swords and iron-tipped spears. Military planning, technique, and tactics, though, were components that led to Assyrian victories. Assyrians created bridges and pontoons to cross over waterways like rivers. They used battering rams, and they dug beneath city walls to weaken them. They also fired volleys of arrows and fought with great shoulder-to-shoulder discipline. The Assyrians were, as I said earlier, ruthless and merciless. They killed or enslaved their victims, including women and children, and the elderly also. Roman numeral 2, it's with these ideologies that the empire begins to expand. Between 850 BC and 650 BC, the kings of Assyria defeated the following regions: Syria, Palestine, and Babylon, or Babylonia. Eventually, the Assyrians ruled lands that extended into Egypt and even Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. The way that they governed was that the land that was closest to their home territory They ruled those as provinces, and they made them dependent territories. Assyrian kings would control these dependent regions by appointing or choosing their rulers, or by supporting kings who had already been in control of those areas but decided to align themselves with the Assyrians. The Assyrian system of having local governors report back to a central authority like a king became the fundamental model of administration or system of government throughout most of the Middle East and then eventually throughout Europe. Military expansion, though, brought in new territory and brought in a lot of money in the form of tribute. Tribute is a tax that weaker powers pay to a greater one in order to avoid being totally destroyed. So the Assyrians had a lot of people paying them tribute. Now, here's what would happen. If in the Assyrian world, if a conquered people would refuse to pay them, they would destroy their cities absolutely. They would burn them to the ground. They would kill all of the people there, or they would send them into exile. This is an example of rule by fear, which proved to be an effective method. Now, what else might they do? There's a lot of different things. They had a lot of harsh punishments. They could enslave the people. Things of that nature were all some of the things that the Assyrians did. Assyrian culture is centered around the capital city of Nineveh. Nineveh was Assyria's capital. It's built along the Tigris River. It had a wall around it, about 3 miles long and about a mile wide, and it was the largest wall of its time. Nineveh was also home to one of the world's largest libraries in the ancient times. There was a famous king named Ashurbanipal who was known for collecting during his lifetime more than 20,000 clay tablets from all throughout the Fertile Crescent. One of the most prized possessions at the library was the Epic of Gilgamesh. This was an old Sumerian story about a warrior who is off on the warpath and trying to find his way home, and he's enlightened in many different fashions. And that's one of the ways we know about the Sumerian people, by the way. But this library at Nineveh was organized by subject matter and catalog, just like a library would if you were to go there today. Roman numeral 3 is going to talk about how the empire falls. Well, there's a couple of possible factors that may have led to their fall. Number one, they may have grown too large and spread themselves too thin to control. And then one of the key things that I want you to remember is that rule by fear, that cruelty, that's going to have earned the Assyrians many enemies who were looking to get revenge at some point in time. Capital A, we're going to talk about some of those groups in decline and fall. In 612 BC, a combined force of the Medes and the Chaldeans defeated the Assyrians and later burned Nineveh to the ground. We'll talk about the Chaldeans. They did have help from the Medes, but after they defeated the Assyrians, they took over Babylon and they made Babylon their capital. Around 600 BC, Babylon became the center of a new empire. This is more than 1,000 years after Hammurabi had first ruled there and started the first major Babylonian empire. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar is probably the most famous king at Babylon during this time. He was a Chaldean king. He restored Babylon to its great historical standpoint. He's most famous for building the Hanging Gardens, which he had built for one of his many wives. I'll show you a little bit of what the Hanging Gardens may have looked like here. It was believed to be a 7-tiered building, and you can see some of the architecture, and then you have all types of flower beds and flora and fauna and plants hanging over the edge. These would have to be watered by slaves on a daily basis, but the story goes that Nebuchadnezzar had over 20 wives. This was very common for this time period, but one of his wives was from the distant mountains, and she sort of missed the flora and fauna and the environment that surrounded her homeland, and she wanted to go back home. Well, Nebuchadnezzar, his goal was to send some of his people to her homeland, bring some of the native plants, and then create a structure for her that she would kind of feel like she was at home. It's one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. We don't have much evidence of it anymore. It had very thick walls, and it was 7 layers. It was more than 300 feet high and visible for miles, people would say. The Chaldeans also observed the stars and planets. Many of their findings form the basis for modern astronomy and astrology. But the empire fell shortly after Nebuchadnezzar's death, and eventually they were taken over by the Persians, which we learned about with the end of the Babylonian captivity when King of Persia, Cyrus the Great, released the Hebrews and allowed them to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple.